Thank you all for joining us at this nearly uncivilized hour of 9 a.m. on a Saturday. Welcome to Infrastructure and the Future, Assessing the Architect's Role. Today's conference is the first in a series organized by the School of Architecture at Northeastern, which will address real-world issues facing architects today, particularly issues that span between the academic and the professional realm. Our larger aim here is to question and hopefully broaden our understanding of the role of architecture in addressing issues that are facing the contemporary city. But why infrastructure? Certainly this is a hot topic at the moment. Infrastructure, of course, was a central component of President Obama's stimulus plan. The New York Times annual architecture issue this year was focused on infrastructure. Closer to home, we see panels at various architecture conferences, both professional and academic, issues of journals and magazines, including the most recent issue of Architecture Boston, and even supposedly like this one, all addressing the topic of infrastructure. But as we were conceptualizing the conference, it seemed to us that none of these were really asking what for us was a crucial question, which is what is the role of the architect? Whether publicly or privately funded, architects have traditionally participated in major public works projects, designs of schools, rail stations, other buildings of public utility. And certainly while such projects continue to have value, the emergence of new technologies, settlement patterns, and economic relationships mandate that architects find new ways for participating in contemporary debates over where the country might most rationally and profitably invest in the future. Our aim then today is to not only ask fundamental questions regarding infrastructure's definition and scope, but to demarcate more speculative strategies for architecture involvement moving forward. This conference is different from most in two respects. First is this diverse and esteemed group of colleagues and speakers that we've assembled today: architects, planners, landscape architects, engineers, policymakers, historians, information designers. But second, and perhaps even more important, is the format of the event. And this format, some of you I know keep asking me, really, I don't have to present anything, but it's really going to focus on, not on individual papers, but on a conversation and a debate. I have to stress this point. Our panelists today are not going to be presenting papers. Instead, the moderator in each of the three panels will lead the discussion through a series of focused questions. And the aim here really is to generate meaningful debate about this critical issue, as well as to gain this multidisciplinary perspective that's both pragmatic and critical. By bringing together this group of experts with first-hand knowledge in materializing projects, as well as researchers and a concerned public, all of you, we hope to produce knowledge on the topic in a way that reflects Northeastern's commitment to addressing these contemporary challenges and socially relevant issues as they arise out of practice. The day is organized into three panels. As you'll see, everyone should have picked up, there was a little pamphlet as you walked in that lists the itinerary. The first panel is on civic infrastructure, second on systems infrastructure, and a third on green infrastructure. Grouping the subject matter in this way enabled us to bring together speakers with a common expertise, and it also, in our initial research leading up to the conference, we found that there was critical areas of interest, and they suggested different architectural agendas. A few logistical matters for the day. If you look at your schedule, I'm going to finish my remarks. George will give some opening remarks. We'll have our first panel, civic infrastructure, then we'll have a half-an-hour coffee break. We'll come back for our second panel on systems infrastructure. We'll have a lunch break. You'll see there's a little handout of local area restaurants for that. We'll break for lunch between 1 and 2. Then we'll have our final panel between 2 and 2:30, a wrap-up discussion for a half an hour, and then please join us afterwards for a reception in the lobby where we just came in. Also, for those of you here interested in the AIA CES credits, there will be a registration table at the end of the day outside where you can just please do sign in so you can so we can register that and you can get your credits. I think that goes for the speakers too. Some of us who need to keep our license current. Just a few quick thank yous. I do want to thank our office manager Danielle Walquist for helping me with some things, and more importantly, Dennis Greenwood, my tireless work study, who's here, who helped me a lot today, especially that he put together that beautiful pamphlet that you have. I want to thank also all the faculty here at Northeastern, but particularly Roy Kozlowski and Lucy Malsey and Kyle Moe for their assistance in conceptualizing and helping to realize the conference. And finally, I want to thank George Thrush, the chair of the department, for making this event possible through his enthusiastic stewardship. So, and now I'd like to ask George to come up and deliver some introductory remarks, and then I'll be back to introduce the moderators. Thank you.
Okay, well, I promise to be very brief, but I would be remiss if I didn't add our thanks to Amanda for putting together this fabulous conference, so thank you, Amanda. And Amanda is right that we see this conference as part of a much larger project, I think, one that brings to bear the creative and analytical skills of the architect to a wide range of real challenges facing our cities. And this mission of urban engagement here at Northeastern takes many forms. Some of our faculty are working on what one might call more traditional areas of research, such as more energy efficient and architecturally flexible building panels and whole new approaches to heating and cooling buildings. In fact, our colleague Kyle Moe is not here because he's in Rome as a fellow at the American Academy working on his project, which has a great title, The Thermodynamic Figuration of Rome. I can't wait to see what comes of that. But there are others here, I think, that are also working on things that are less typical for architecture schools to work on. One of them is a focus on the market-driven building types that actually shape the everyday character of our cities and account for surely 95% of our built environment. I'm talking about urban housing and office buildings, parking structures, hotels, retail spaces, and the like. These are not peripheral elements of study at the school, but actually the focus of graduate education here is trying to really pay attention to those things that have a meaningful impact on our built environment. In earlier conferences, we've looked at the changing landscape of urban design, at the remarkable differences between urban housing in Europe and the United States. And this coming spring, we'll be hosting yet another one-day event on a new approach to what many would call the holy grail of modern architecture. I speak, of course, of prefabricated housing. This conference, though, will be a bit different in the sense that it will include not only designers and manufacturers' perspectives on prefabricated housing, but also regional politicians. Mayors of economically depressed post-industrial New England cities are also going to participate in this event in the hope that we can devise a new strategy for prefabricated housing that works to the benefit of these regional economies in both the manufacture and the consumption. So this we're looking forward to, and we'll be adding news about that as we confirm a date. So as we get ready for this day, I want to reiterate a couple of things that Amanda said, because this is a very different format than almost all of us are used to, unless, like me, you're a journalism junkie and spent your formative years watching Fred-friendly programs on television. I think I'm probably the only person in this room who fits that description. As we move forward, Amanda will introduce our moderators for each of the three panels, and the moderators will then in turn introduce the panelists. And I would just reiterate, with regard to this format, the biggest difference is that the moderator is king. The moderator shapes the discussion. The moderator will be asking panelists questions. If you've been to other academic conferences in architecture, there's a number of different criteria by which decisions get made. One is the volume of the speaker, the willingness to insert and cut off other speakers. In this case, all of that authority rests with the moderator, and please join me in helping empower our moderators that way. And I would add, finally, that the real objective of this format is, in the words of Fred Friendly, when talking about the virtues of this approach, the idea is to make the process of decision-making so excruciating that there is no way to escape without thinking. And I hope that we can live up to Mr. Friendly's dreams and goals. And I want to really thank all of you very much for coming. I think there'll be more joining us a bit later. But welcome to all of you, and I hope you enjoy the day's events. And we'll get started with the first panel. Thank you very much.
So I'll introduce our first moderator, and then I'll invite all the panelists to come up when the moderator comes up as well. So our first moderator today is Sarah Williams-Goldhagen. Sarah currently serves as the architecture critic for the New Republic, where, among other things, she has written on the state of America's infrastructure and the necessity for public-private cooperation. For many years, Sarah taught history and theory at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, having received her doctorate in art history at Columbia. Her book, Blue Constituted Modernism and Anxious Modernism's Experimentations in Post-War Architecture Culture, opened up entirely new readings of post-war modernism. I was going to say important readings of post-war modernism, but as a reader of my dissertation, Sarah repeatedly chastised me for the overuse of the word important. So we are looking forward to the training of Sarah's incisive critical mind to the subject of civic infrastructure. Sarah?
Yeah, that would be good. Thank you. Now, how does this go on? That's the one thing I don't know. There we go. Okay, can you hear me? Up there, is the mic going? Is it good? Of course, that means you also get to hear me cough. I apologize for that, but there's nothing catching. So, thank you. I'm very excited to be here and to be with the panelists today. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. When I first got the invitation from Amanda and George to do something on infrastructure, I wrote an article in the New Republic about 2-3 years ago on infrastructure. Which I presume is why you invited me. And since then, I've tried to read every article I could find that has the word infrastructure in it, and have begun to despair because it's such a big and amorphous, ill-defined term. When my article in the New Republic came out, the tagline, which the editors came up and put on the cover, was "Making Infrastructure Sexy." And at that point, not very many people were thinking about infrastructure, and I looked at it and I thought, oh my God, I hope everybody knows I don't have anything to do with these titles. But since then, it's become sexy. Stunningly enough, everywhere. Harvard is having a lecture series this fall. MIT is having a lecture series this fall. Here we have Northeastern. It goes on and on and on. And I think one of the things that we can begin to do today with our enormously esteemed panelists on all three panels is to begin to kind of break the concept of infrastructure down into definable terms, because it's too big to talk about just as infrastructure. And even the organization of these three panels, civic infrastructure, green infrastructure, systems infrastructure, begins to do that. And I was happy as I was thinking about this yesterday. I was increasingly relieved to think, well, you know, civic infrastructure is probably the easiest to understand. That I think we can get a handle on, although that's one of the questions I'm going to be asking our panelists. A couple of focusing points. So I want to break down and really talk about civic infrastructure, what it is, how we can move it forward. One question that I want to put off the table, just because I think that you talk about one or the other, is I don't think that we should spend our time today talking about maintenance, but rather about how to use infrastructure in the United States and Europe and Asia to move societies forward in ways that we're interested in knowing. So that's just one framing issue. Okay, I'll introduce the panelists. We have Guido Hartré over here, who's an associate at Rogers Marvell Architects. He has written a number of provocative articles about infrastructure and worked with New York City's Metropolitan Transit Authority on a flood mitigation project, which now we need to move forward here. Sorry. Oh, sorry. It's just one of my favorite infrastructure issues. This was actually in New York City after the steam blast a couple of years ago in Midtown. Okay. Worked with the MTA on flood mitigation and came up with a design for street furniture that also served to solve problems and foresee storm drainage issues for 100-year storms with these very elegant sort of benches, street sculpture type things. Robert Culver, over here to my right, is President and CEO of Mass Development, a corporation of the state of Massachusetts. Mass Development is everywhere. It's a company to support and initiate development investment in all sectors of the Massachusetts economy. They do public-private partnerships, commercial, industrial, residential. They work with nonprofits. They work with private corporations, and have supported a number of civic projects, including the Berkshire Theater Festival in Stockbridge, the Danforth Museum of Art in Framingham, and the Community Rowing Boathouse in Oak Square in Brighton, which is on the screen. Marcel Smets is chief architect, over here to my left, of the Flemish region. That's sort of a daunting thing for us to think that you're the chief architect of the Flemish region. So I'd love to hear more about that. Anyway, and professor of theory and practice of urbanism at Leuven University. He was the chief of a project for the transformation of the area around Louvain and has worked in a number of European cities, including Antwerp, Rouen, and Genoa. He founded at the Catholic University of Leuven a research and development unit devoted to restructuring abandoned post-industrial and railway zones, and has founded a number of kind of think tank organizations in Europe that have moved thought on infrastructure forward. Marilyn Jordan Taylor, also to my left, is dean at Penn Design, the School of Architecture, Planning, and so on and so on and so forth, at the University of Pennsylvania. Marilyn Taylor spent over 35 years at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, most recently heading the Urban Design and Planning Department. She also founded at SOM the Airports and Transportation Project. She's been involved in a number of major and large-scale infrastructural projects in the United States, Europe, and Asia, including the Manhattanville Master Plan in New York City, Terminal 4 at JFK, Terminal 3 at Singapore's Shanghai Airport. It goes on and on and on, as do with most of these people. Taylor was also the first architect and the first woman to serve as chairwoman of the Urban Land Institute, which she did from 2005 to 2007, which is a nonprofit research and educational institution where she championed the revitalization of cities, sustainable communities, and infrastructure investment. Byron Stiggy leads the Sustainability Consulting Group with the U.S. branch of the UK-based engineering firm Bureau Happold. Bureau Happold, as in my trawling on the internet last night, seems to do everything. They do engineering, they do wastewater management, they do sustainability, they design bridges, and you've done a lot of it too, including most recently the Orange County Great Park in Irvine, California, which you see on the screen, strategic master plan for Governor's Island in New York City, and the sustainability part of the Telepur Techno City in Hyderabad, India, development for a new city on 400 acres, working with Paycock Freed and Ken Smith. And last but certainly not least, my buddy Hubert Murray. He's my buddy because I was on a panel with him last month. The first time I met him, this is the second, but he's great. Manager of Sustainable Initiatives at Partners Healthcare, and formerly, for this audience, probably most relevantly, Chief Architect of the Boston Central Artery Project. Hubert, I want to tell you, I was in New York day before yesterday, and I was saying I was going to be moderating this panel, and and that you were to be on it. And the director of the Architectural League said, there was an architect of the Central Artery Project? That's so cool. And there he is. He managed over, but it's still standing, exactly, managed 45 architects and directed the design of all the highway elements, the buildings and streetscapes for the ongoing and never-ending Central Artery project in Boston, although finally ended. So welcome to all of you. I'm really pleased to have you here. I guess let's start with what I said I wanted to start with, which is I would like each of you to begin by telling me what you think civic infrastructure is. And we'll just go this way and then take things from there. Guido?
So I thought a little bit about that question, and seems, from my perspective, all infrastructure is civic infrastructure.
Say that again?
All infrastructure is civic infrastructure. If we think about infrastructure as the thing that functionally connects the different kind of uses, the different people that occupy the city, the different neighborhoods of the city, and we think about civic space, and civic space has always had the role of creating this kind of functional, experiential tie between the individual citizens of the city and the city as a whole. And when we think of how a typical neighborhood operates, it's very evident that you're in the street, you share that street with other people, that street is shared by multiple different uses, and so it's very clear how that is both infrastructure, but it's also civic space. I think as we get into pieces of infrastructure that we might be tempted to think have a single role, that breaks down. Now they're only playing a functional role as their infrastructural role, but they're no longer playing a civic role. And the problem is that in the scale of the city, as we have it, that means that the public space structure of the city kind of breaks down with that, because you have functional ties, but you don't have the civic tie that would go with that, falls apart.
I think that one of the things that we, as George and Amanda and Tim and I were, and Tom, were usefully discussing is, I mean, Tom at one point said, well, maybe you can just think about infrastructure you can see and infrastructure you can't see. Communications infrastructure, and I do think that's actually a useful beginning, even if it's kind of a dumb beginning. Hubert?
Right. Well, whether it's visible or invisible, I'm thinking of it in terms of the hard and the soft. As a foreigner in this country, what strikes me as being the most fundamental infrastructure that holds this country together is the Constitution. I would call that, on the soft side, a really fundamental piece of infrastructure.
What do you mean?
Well, in the sense that you can think on the hard side, there are things which are an economic stimulus, or they are things that connect one thing with another. So the primary elements, such as buildings, schools, what have you, are connected by the secondary elements, such as sewers, electricity, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then questions of necessity and sufficiency come in as a sort of dialogue between those two. But I think it's the soft side that has to be the sort of, at least the kickoff of this conversation. For instance, for the last few months we've been talking about healthcare. I would regard universal healthcare as a fundamental piece of infrastructure, of our imagined community of the United States of America. And it depends how you imagine that community. Does it include the people who are at the moment not insured and not covered for their health care? Another example of that is the newspapers. The newspapers are in sad decline, and that is really a part of our intellectual infrastructure that is withering even as we speak. And then the sort of three infrastructure pillars: schools, libraries, and the newspaper used to be the fundamentals by which we went about our business.
Mm-hmm.
So, take the Federal Library, for instance. What it started with was the concept, which is we need to connect Logan Airport with Seattle somehow. I mean, there's an idea. And the second part of the concept was we need to reconnect the city with the world. There's an idea. And that is what I would call the soft side and the most important side, after which follows all the hard stuff.
I think that's an interesting point because, and civic is, it's really built into the word civic, which is even though we are here going to focus on the built environment, underneath the built environment is a vision of what civic, what life is and what social life is and what goals we want to promote, which is what you're talking about. Is really essential in thinking about how we want to conceptualize and move forward with infrastructure. So there is an inevitable intermeshing between the social, the political, inevitably the economic, and the physical design of these things. Robert?
Thank you first, and thank you particularly Northeastern for doing this. Hubert and I did not talk at all before this, but it's very interesting that in the job that I have now, and I would note that I have worked for the MBTA in years past dealing with issues. I've worked at Yale having to sit with Bob Stern and Cesar Pelli having to adjudicate the architectural worth of everything. And now in this position, and when I started this job, it's almost 6 years ago now, and Governor Romney was governor at the time, and they give you a stack of paper like this, and they say, okay, infrastructure. Tell us what we ought to be focused on. And I would tell you that from my perspective, I said, I know you think I'm going to talk about roads or bridges or new urbanism or smart growth or something like that. But the thing that has not been dealt with in this Commonwealth, and I would suggest in most states in the United States and certainly in Europe in a long time, like 300 years, is the geopolitical infrastructure. And for you, the architects, to be successful, if we do not start to bring, and I know that you want to talk about the harder side of the stuff, but if we do not bring into focus the dysfunctional, the disruptive, the slow geopolitical process that allows us to make decisions about where we're going to build, what we're going to build, and how we're going to build it, we are in fact going to be in very, very deep trouble relative to the future of the built environment, because things are just moving too quickly as relates to the energy front, as relates to issues of sustainability or non-sustainability, as relates to the way in which populations are growing and expanding, as relates to the question of how cities are going to be used versus how the suburban environment is either going to be destroyed or built up. We do not have, all of you know this, that have competed for and tried to get work done on a timely and profitable basis, a geopolitical environment that allows for reasonably quick development, except for, in this Commonwealth, one place which I happen to manage, and it just came to me, and that is a place called Devens, Massachusetts, which is not an incorporated town. It's the only environment in this Commonwealth of 351 cities and towns that is not incorporated. I run it, and yeah, I do, and oh, by the way, the Chinese just called us out at Devens as being the only city in the United States that they wanted to talk to about sustainability. Don't ask me why. I have no idea what that's all about.
Okay,
no
now,
idea.
let me just
The
ask
issue being we can get things done in 79 days, and get things permitted, in the ground, built in that short period of time, and commit to the architect, the engineer, and the builder that can happen. And I think that's that's one of the most important things we have to do.
Okay, so what is it, I think that's right, because, I mean, when you're dealing with a topic or a subject as big as infrastructure, that politics and political expediency is critical. We all know this, right? So what is it about your city? Is it because you're the emperor? I don't say that
Yeah.
facetiously.
Benign dictator.
Yes.
The, right, yeah, right. Let's focus. It happened out of fear. BRAC, I don't know how many, the Base Reallocation Closure Act came along. It happens to a lot of large spaces of land here and in Europe, where all of a sudden the Department of Defense, the largest employer in the whole world, says we're shutting down hundreds of acres in the middle of someplace. Scared the living daylights out of the body politic. The body politic then said, here, we want this agency to run this because we are scared now that we've lost 2,500, 3,000 jobs, that we don't know what to do with it. And in addition to that, we're going to give you $200 million for infrastructure development.
The body politic being the
The
local
legislature.
or the state?
State legislature.
At the state level. Interesting. Okay.
Fear and greed. I hate to be the bludgeon. That has a lot to do with the advancement of fear.
All right, we have people who've worked a lot in Europe. Maybe we can talk about fear and greed. No. Byron, tell me your thoughts. Sure.
Thank you very much for having me. Great to be here. Actually, I'm going to talk about my work in the developing countries because I think that was the focal point on how much civic infrastructure we have here in the U.S. And I've been seeing the difference working around the world in a gamut between public and private. When you think of a private thing like a personal home or your office space, that's clearly not civic infrastructure, and all the way to what we're thinking about as publicness. And I think civic infrastructure are all the things the private sector won't do on their own accord.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they won't do them are because there are market gaps, like below market rate housing is a clear market gap, and it's a civic infrastructure. Or drinking water supply, there's a market gap because there's no economic justification to supply drinking water. And number two, there are inherent monopolies in a lot of the things that we call civic infrastructure. So we shouldn't let the private sector develop electricity, for example, because they're just going to, the deregulation was a good example of why that's a civic infrastructure. And thirdly, what I'm seeing a lot of in developing countries is that infrastructure has a return on investment over a private sector horizon. There's just no electricity and water and sanitation in Africa, India. And so if you want to develop a world-class development, you have to build your own roads and your own water and your own electricity. And they just build it so poorly because their return on investment is only 5 years. And so that's clearly not a civic infrastructure when the private sector does it in their own return on investment.
Mm-hmm.
And then fourthly, clearly just public benefit. Sanitation is a public health benefit. And that's why
I want you to go on, but I have one comment, which that's all you have to, or I'm sure you have plenty more to say, which is Adam Smith actually wrote in The Wealth of Nations that the one thing that governments have a responsibility to provide is civic infrastructure and public good, because it will never be profitable for private corporations to do that, and societies can't function, economies can't function without them, which is more or less what you're saying. I think that's a very good point. Marilyn?
Well, I thought I'd twist it around just a little bit.
Go ahead.
And instead of saying what is civic infrastructure, say what makes infrastructure civic.
Good.
Because for me, there's a sort of a conflation, and I agree with it, between public and civic.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just focus on it, because I tend to think of infrastructure that is civic as an outcome and not just an objective. That is, there is a true public benefit in a very broad way to what's done. It represents society. It promotes the goals of whether it's environmental sustainability, opportunity for individuals, or competitive advantage. And so I think if we want to address it successfully, we have to think of it in that way, and not just a label that is easily generalized to include everything. which I think is a very important way of thinking, but that our conversation can be helpful if we focus in a little bit on what that means. So for me, it does mean, if I go back to inputs, it does mean public investment in accordance with public will. And of course, public will comes in different forms in Europe and in Asia than in our very democratic place. But nonetheless, I think one of the things we've been failing to do over the consumer decades is to figure out what that public priority, what that public will is that leads us to larger strategies and the accomplishment of larger goals.
May I just ask for a point of clarification? Is public will the same thing as public goods? What?
No.
Okay.
A public will, in my mind, is that which endorses leaders in the public sector to make their investments.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is a community that stands up and says, I know it's not going to be done in your term of office, but we have to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It is communities that say, hey, we'll take the water tunnel coming through. This is what we want for it. This is the trade-off. These are our objectives for what can be done and what can be accomplished. And I think the problem is, because we've all in our lives, or at least I have, thank you for reminding me how many years I've worked for SOS, have come to realize that we as architects and urbanists can do great dreams for infrastructure, but unless there's public leadership to make public investments supported by public will, they simply don't happen. And so I think when we're thinking about inputs, we have to think about all of those. You can have private funds come in where there's revenue opportunity, where there's a way to expand the scale and scope of the investment. I don't mean to say that infrastructure that is civic is only exclusively public, but without that clarity of vision, which at least in the United States we have to broadly embrace and continue to focus on the long term, then we don't get to what I call civic infrastructure.
I think there have been attempts to privatize certain elements of the infrastructure in the United States. The most famous, which I know anyway, is that in Chicago, a certain section of the highway right outside of Chicago was sold off to a private company, which, because they didn't have the funds or didn't want to come up with the funds publicly in order to fund it, and then the company immediately slapped on a toll of about $8 or $9, making it impossible for the lower income classes to use the highway. And ultimately it failed and reverted back to public ownership. It's enormously problematic, and Marcel, actually this is one of the things that I was very interested in talking to you about and getting from you, because I know in Europe you've done a lot of public-private partnership type things. So could you tell us more about that? Because I think in the United States, most would agree that we haven't quite figured out how to do it yet, and we need to.
I will gladly do that. But try to maybe just first try to also say what in my mind would be civic. And
Okay,
like
good. We'll go back to my initial.
on some of the issues that have been said. So it's a question of where you actually, in a certain way, where you put your ambition. What is your real ambition? Because the question of visible and invisible is important. But maybe we should.
The question of visible and invisible is important.
No, the question of visible and invisible is important, but as you want to stress the architects, let's maybe go to the built environment. What, in my opinion, is that civic is not just equally public.
Okay.
Public, in my opinion, would be the lowest grade of necessity.
Do you mean public, like publicly owned?
Like public investment.
Okay.
And public space is only what is basically required. You know, you need drinking water in order not to get illness. Okay? Civic, in my opinion, goes back, and it's an etymological thing. You know, it goes back to a 19th century, early 20th century idea. When you look at the City Beautiful movement here, they were making civic buildings. And the civic society was something else than the New Deal society. No, the
How?
Well, the New Deal is really that everybody, that there is an awareness that the state should do enough for all its citizens. But there is also, in my mind, to civic, something that is related to a symbolic meaning, to a meaning of a state valuing its citizens.
Mhm.
And that for that reason, try to make the best possible thing,
Mhm.
not the minimum thing. And the best possible thing is because it's the public value and it is the civic value.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in a way, I was very happy with what you said about Africa, and I'm very sorry, but you could also say the same for the United States. You know,
Yep.
the level
No
of
argument here.
development of a nation
It's appalling.
is to be the level of what is the value which society attributes to its civic infrastructure.
Okay, so this is, let's focus in, right? I think we would all agree with this, right? That there's public, which simply means publicly owned and politically connected built environment or initiatives in the built environment. And then there's civic, which is a set of goals about the body politic and about society. So what are our goals with civic infrastructure?
I think it relates to, I think the challenge is as we start to have more concerns with sustainability and systems of infrastructure that we think are invisible, it's to recognize that they're actually all visible in some form, and that a part of the challenge to making them civic is to make that connection, right? If we're talking about getting to the public will, well, if it's invisible, then it's very easy for the infrastructure to be out of sight, out of mind, and it doesn't have a relationship to the public will. It just happens, and it doesn't have to be that kind of that sort of thing that has both a functional role but also a kind of civic, symbolic, social role. You can just kind of relegate it to simple utility, but the problem is then you don't have a basis on which to build an argument about sustainability, about how it's used, about what the trade-offs are in using it. I mean, the MTA project was a kind of a remedial fix of a problem of flooding in the city, but the intention was to take the flooding problem, which has to do with invisible infrastructure, you know, from the MTA's point of view, the subway, which at least you get into, so it's somewhat visible, but then the sewers and all that, which are completely invisible and sort of out of people's minds of their neighborhood and how it operates and why it floods and what the kind of relationship is between kind of permeable surfaces and flooding. All of that is sort of invisible unless we kind of actually take an action to try to make it visible and make it perceptible as part of the public.
Okay, so one of the goals then is to take the parts of infrastructure that are invisible but are critical to the long-term health of the society and to somehow concretize them in ways that make people aware of the interconnectedness of this kind of thing. Robert?
I actually want to follow.
Bob?
Back to this kind of what's going on and how does it relate to architects, as relates to the whole civic infrastructure issue. I long for more interface with architects. It used to be that I did over the you want to go back.
Just go back 40 years.
Yeah, 40 years, right? I think one of the issues, to your point, Jeff, issues to be addressed is that the architect design firms have to be able to get back to being thought leaders about where we are going, to your point, with the design, with the planning, with the development of sustainable infrastructure.
Okay, what would that entail?
And what I worry about is that the economics now, back to your Adam Smith, the economics now are that everybody in this room that's involved with an architectural firm is feeling the heat. I mean, nobody knows what a billable hour is. And it is a problem with us losing the thought leaders in how whether architectural firms should become more public, should be seen in terms of national policy as having some sort of vehicle for subsidizing thinking about the future. And this is sort of a radical idea, but we are missing out on more thoughts. And the architectural industry is not able, except through really well-defined jobs, to challenge us as to what the future ought to look like. And it's a huge issue. And
Okay.
it's scary.
Now,
Are we going through, or are we responding to Robert?
Respond to Robert, I think. Yes.
Responding to Robert. I think, if I can, I completely agree with that, and I spend a lot of time at school talking about that, because I believe that as the world around us, and the world most immediately around us, that is the availability of public funds, the availability of private funds, the real estate industry, and all of those things that have directed decision-making, not just about infrastructure, but about the land use that relates to it. All of it is fundamentally changing. It will be reconfigured. And so there is a tremendous opportunity right now for designers to step forward. And because I'm a pen designer, we have so many different kinds of designers, I use the word designers even to include the artists. It's a wonderful time to be situated in that kind of challenging between disciplines, are becoming more familiar with each other's ways of thinking. I firmly believe that everyone who is going through our school needs to be charged to stand up to leadership responsibility. Now, whether that is your school board, your synagogue, your city, or the universe, somewhere in between, you need to find a place, because when we don't speak up, there are many people that will speak up for us.
mm-hmm.
And so for me, in a sense, the role of, in terms of today, architects and landscape architects I'm putting together, even though I value their difference in ways of thinking enormously, for me, it is a time to find every opportunity we can to hit the cracks in the political establishment who are so comfortable still in the face of all data to the contrary that America is an agrarian country. Take Brookings, 12% of the population, 12% of the land is 65% of the population, is 75% of the jobs, and uses typically a third of the energy that people sitting out there in other far-flung places do. The information is incontrovertible, but the political establishment is very, very slow. And I'm sure, Robert, when you get down to Washington, you hear what I do, which is the administration saying, please get to the Congress. I'm sorry to be so political. Please get to the Congress.
I think it's inevitable to be so political. Go ahead.
Of what we can do.
Of what we, the politicians,
But
can
we,
do.
those who actually can form a public will
Right.
and get that message to our politicians, what we want to do and therefore what we expect to be done. And I think there's a wonderful theme coming here that Byron and Marcel started about that. This is not basics versus amenities. This is making sure that we're at the minimum and then aspiring to something much more.
I mean, I think one of the things that distinguishes every person on this panel is that the public role of the architect is clearly in sight and has been throughout all of your careers. And that is not, unfortunately, not typical in practice. And Hubert, how much have you struggled with this?
A lot.
I know, that's why I asked.
One of the reasons that I'm doing the job that I'm doing in a hospital is that my view is that in a sort of somewhat dysfunctional body politic in the United States as a whole, I mean, which is the healthcare debate, and which is our crumbling infrastructure, my feeling is that as an architect, I could actually really affect some change in an institution. The hospitals, which is about 14 million square feet and 12 hospitals, etc., seemed like a good field in which to start, in which to develop as it were, a public will about going sustainable, making the hospitals green. What I'm finding is that, in contrast to the university, it's actually a lot harder to develop a public will about a sustainability program, because what we don't have in the hospitals is a sort of constantly refreshed body politic, if you like, of students who are idealistic and will sort of brook no opposition. And that has proved to be a tremendous boost to the universities, actually taking the lead in sustainability programs and showing municipalities and states really where they need to go, not only in what is being built on the ground in the institution, but what people are being taught in the institution to go out and do. You know, in hospitals, we're dealing with sick people who've got other things on their mind. So the strategy has to be different, and actually the tactics have to be different, and it's basically economic. To win the leadership over to the argument that one has to think of life cycle costing, a very simple concept, so that capital cost is weighed against returns on investment in a rather longer term than 3 years.
Yeah, 3 years. Marcel, yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think that basically the society of today absolutely needs architects. And when I say no, I'll try to make my point clear. And when I say architects, it's not only architects. I mean, apparently we had yesterday in Harvard a very interesting discussion on the landscapes of energy, showing that the invisible is really structuring what is happening in our society. So when I say architects, that includes planners, that includes landscape architects, the designers. We have to stop thinking in terms of solutions, that we have to resolve new problems. And I'm relatively close to politics the last 4 years because I'm doing this mandate. And what I constantly see is that our policies all over the world are organized in sectorial manner. We have ministers of environment, and they are different from ministers of public works, and they are different from ministers of nature, natural preservation. And basically, what we are dealing with today in our societies, which are so crowded, is space. And space is not sectorial. Space involves all these things at the same time.
And so how do you...
So what we need is not a policy, we need a project.
What do you mean by project?
A project is something that involves all the sector of policy making and starts out from the organization of space, starts out from designerly thinking. And this is where we need designers. Because social scientists, I'm sorry, have never been formed to think that way. We are the only profession that have, and our universities do this all over the world, that try to resolve complex problems by operating in a designerly way.
And how are you, in your post, operationalizing that? Because Europe is so different in terms of, Hubert mentioned 3 years as a time horizon, which is quite typical in the United States. Europeans tend to have much longer time horizons. So how are you doing this?
Well, it's very difficult to generalize it, bringing project by project.
Right.
But what the basic aim would be is that to say, what is the obligation of the public government? And this obligation, and then we basically come often to infrastructure, is providing that what the private sector will never do, or will never do in the right way. So it is not only building or designing and building, it is also setting the rules for what should be done in the public-private situation for the private sector.
Can you give one concrete example so that I think it would help people to conceptualize this?
Well, it's because you talked about the project which I was happy to organize during 12 years or so. Well, our group, which was a university-based design group, designed all the road networks, the parkings, the railway stations, and so forth, but also did the urbanistic plans in order to gear the development later. You know, which was massing of the volumes, which basically was determining the price of the land, and so forth and so on. Right? And it is because we were able to do these two things at the same time, because obviously the public investment in the infrastructure gives plus value. So if you don't control the plus value that you create by your own means, you don't create a city, or you don't create a civic environment.
Right. There's one, Sean Donovan spoke, Sean Donovan, who's now the Secretary of HUD, spoke at the Graduate School of Design a few weeks ago, and he said something that really struck me, which is that, he said two things. One is he said we can no longer talk about HUD as being the steward of low-cost housing. We can't talk about low-income housing at all, because that's to take one typology and a typology for one social group and to isolate it, and to focus the government agency only on this typology and this social group. He said now we talk about neighborhood development. And neighborhood development includes all aspects of the development and also includes what is now called affordable housing. And I thought that was a useful analogy for what architects need to do to reconceptualize their role in society moving forward, is that it's no longer just a building. You are the steward of the public environment. The other thing he said is that it was a completely novel innovation that he made in HUD, Housing and Urban Development, that he picked up the phone and started talking to the people at the Department of Transportation, and that they had lunch every couple of weeks, and the Environmental Protection Agency. So there is this kind of interconnectedness, which is both necessary and can get out of control politically, I think, particularly in this country. Now, in the United States, I still can't figure out why it's so difficult to do what you, Marcel, have done as the czar of the built environment in the Flemish region. Yes?
Just as an example, we did some work with the Metropolitan Transportation Association, which has a goal in New York State that I think it was something like 50% of new development would happen within kind of a transit, kind of within the radius of the transit stop, so that it could be kind of transit-oriented development. And so so the MTA is great in that respect, because they're doing this kind of overall look at the area that they span, which is pretty broad radius around New York City, and so that's fantastic. But then when they go to implementation, they have to look at the implementation from the point of view of these are the parcels that we control. And so you have something that's incredibly ambitious, but obviously the parcels that they control are never going to kind of result in that kind of ambitious goal that they set for themselves. And I think it relates exactly to the question of the sectorial division, because once the problem has been kind of put in the field of a specific agency, and they have drafted an RFP, and you've responded to the RFP, essentially the design problem is probably, the good one is probably already gone. Because the good one actually looks at a much broader problem, which is an interagency problem, and in fact, the MTA's problem is really a problem, which is really a planning problem. And so I think it's really the question of how you get into this position where you are the steward that sort of has to bridge between these agencies. But the problem is that that's very messy, for the person who ends up being your client in structures where we end up working. You're causing all sorts of trouble in that, because here they've gone through this whole process to neatly define a problem and hand it to you, the architect, to solve,
but in fact, that whole process of neatly defining the problem was really excluding most of the really interesting and innovative solutions to that problem, because they had to continue narrowing down the problem to what was, under their, what they could directly affect.
I think the question to us is, right now is the role of the architect and why is it so hard in the U.S. and why are we struggling so much. I've had the good fortune of working with probably hundreds of architects over the last 10 years, in the U.S. and Europe and India and Japan. And it seems to me that the best architects don't say it's someone else's problem. I mean, someone else probably didn't do a good job, but the best architects structure a compelling argument that develops a good civic infrastructure project. And the worst architects simply say because. They draw something, they render something, they say, doesn't it look beautiful? And everyone says, not so much, how can we make it cheaper? And the best architects start with this logical process, and I'm actually thinking European architects, a really strong talent at. And I'm totally stereotyping here. American architects render the bird's eye view, right? It's sort of design process.
Okay, so what constitutes,
Totally stereotyping.
I mean, in the abstract, it's difficult to discuss, but what constitutes a compelling argument?
Well, based on goals. And I think I want to get back to your question on goals, because when I work in Europe, there's always a stepping back. What are our goals? What are we really trying to achieve here? And
We achieve socially,
Yeah.
achieve aesthetically, what?
yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, yes, all of those things. I mean, very few projects really stop at the beginning and define goals and ever really return to them throughout the project. And
In the United States.
well, yeah, just generally. I mean,
We can bash Americans,
Yeah,
it's okay.
I think, and that's something as I've found myself doing just as a sustainability practitioner. What are we really trying to do here? And then reminding ourselves, what are we really trying to do here? And structuring arguments on why the handrails need to be beautiful, why we need to spend extra money on the paving, why we actually need to do the things we do.
Okay, let's break this down, because the people who tend to go into the built environment tend to believe in the built environment and tend to believe that they can make a contribution. So why is it that it's difficult to establish a set of goals and then push them through? Okay, Marilyn, you're up.
Well, I was just thinking how I've been taking an unusual position for me of not bashing the way that we make decisions.
That's fine.
And find some positive ground here. I think that if you look at what America is and can be, we have a remarkable quality of inventiveness, of invention.
Agreed.
Of starting. And this is where I think there is maybe a line of logic that can change the way that we have been thinking about it. When we are most successful as American industry, we start in research and arrive at a moment of intuition that sparks an idea, and then you're off and running. But that research is always there to remind you what goals you set out for yourself, what you were trying to prove. You may prove that a drug for arthritis really works for male sexuality, but nonetheless, you know what you started out to do. And I think that one of the things we need to do is to reinsert the pre-design phase of our projects. I'm making the case at Penn that the Academy's penchant for research really isn't different from that which should be the penchant of the entire profession whenever we start a project. And that doesn't mean it's always lab with things boiling out of test tubes or looking at the finest new materials. Sometimes it is social research through the eyes of the architect who will assemble the information in a very different way. And in this rush to spend as much money as we possibly could for our private clients and to get things done in a hurry for our public clients, that time to stop and think about what it is that we're trying to achieve is getting squeezed and lost. And frankly, we haven't helped it by saying, oh, We have 2 weeks. We'll write the algorithms, we'll generate the scheme, it'll look beautiful, and everybody will love it. Well, no reason. I mean, why are we then surprised when it kind of crumbles? Ozymandias down in the sand again, and we have to start all over. I do think that in I equally credit Sean Donovan, Ray LaHood, the Obama administration, Vincent Chu, they have a mindset to talk to each other.
They do.
And we, therefore, need to try to find ways to be responsive to that, which does go to thinking about longer-term values, how you evaluate them in the interim, but how you make the case for where the value is in the long term. And I think it has to be research-based and goal-based in order to accomplish that.
Okay, now one question. I know there are a lot of people to talk to. Yes. Go ahead.
Using specifics on the civic infrastructure, if we just use the city of Boston, and you go back to the development of the Back Bay, you go back to the development of Commonwealth Avenue, you go back to the development of the MBTA, these things happen without these kinds of discussions. In other words, there wasn't, and it's to the point being made about a civic will, there was sort of a uniform culture, if you will, which allowed private sector folks to speculate, to fill in a Back Bay, to really actually want to be the owners of beautiful architecture and design and things that were sustainable and the like. We then go forward to build to what then the federal government did after the great cities sort of did their thing, and we see the Tennessee Valley Authority come along, we see the dams projects come along, and then we see the National Highway System come along, all of which become more and more functional, less and less asking the question in any broader sense of what are we doing here. And they really also start to migrate towards capital and what are we doing to promote industry, business, and capital. And then the good Dean's question is, what's the worst? So how come this isn't happening today? And how do we get architects to do this? Well, there are a lot of kind of what I would refer to as Gucci architects, who are being hired by wealthy people to create these sustainable, beautiful, wealthy environments for them in the Hamptons. Okay? And they drive their own jets to get to places. And they have their own limo-driven car. And so the issue of the wealth and the folks who are there's tons of capital to do this the right way. But these folks have now migrated, and I don't know how to get into sort of total political classes thing, but it's there. That it's no longer a TVA issue. It's no longer why don't we have an airport system that works issue. It's no longer they, power, real money power structures, all these sectors will say, we need to support sustainability. And I think the reason, the question was asked, as to why this isn't happening, is because, in fact, they got it themselves. Last point of reference. For those of you who have not been to the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that sits on the Hudson River in the little town of Hyde Park, New York, you should do that. Because you will get a sense of the man who was a man of wealth, prestige, and power, and the way in which he lived, which I believe then allowed him to say, it's not about you. He lived a rather humble environment. He was a man who understood that it was his job to preserve, promote, and protect the entire environment in the United States. We have been lacking that over the last at least 20, if not 30 years.
Well, I would object to that. I mean, look at Millennium Park in Chicago, which was a public-private thing in which there were millions and millions of dollars poured into this civic good.
Some people say that that's a private ego park.
Okay. Well, there's someone in the audience, a featured panelist, who has
Could we
something
just
to
point out that
say.
if
Yes.
there are FDRs around, they're more likely to be mayors, and the civic administration,
Yes.
they're more likely
To be mayors.
mayors.
Exactly. I do think that one of the focal points is that, the federal government is doing good things, but there has to be some kind of way of getting it down to a regional level, a regional vision, that I think politically is a very difficult thing to do. You wanted to say something. Yes.
I'd like to pick up on a few of the points you guys have nine. Firstly, on the theme that ego is fast, that is right, wrong. I really do think that the procurement system in this country, the ability to the range of opportunities for professionals who should be in cities. Good is policy-based selection and the RFP process in avoiding some of the worst that we find in other countries, low-cost bidding and all of that. It really does put people in boxes, the whole process, and I think does inhibit the ability of professionals.
You mean procurement systems, how architects are hired for public projects and engineers? Okay.
And certainly from our firm's perspective, I think that we would find that we are more limited in that way in this country than in many other countries where we've been able to initiate things much more. So I think that issue is worthy of discussion. I wanted to pick up on the little bit of debate about the public-private and the private sector role. I don't think you will mean that public-private partnership does work absolutely fantastic successfully in many parts of the world. And I do think it is a limitation that they are so little understood in this country. I think more could be done with public-private partnership in this country.
People are trying. Of course.
Possibly one of the most significant ways of professional initiation and knowledge, if you like, since the great engineers of Grinnell started, their offices next to Whitehall for very good reason, and influenced public decision. I think the public-private partnership is really a discussion. I agree very much with Aaron's point that it must happen within the regulatory framework, otherwise it's not very practical. The other thing I wanted to touch on was there's a little back and forth between the theme of the underdeveloped world and the developed world and specifically the United States here. And I think it is quite difficult to have those two conversations together, even though the technical stuff looks more to say. The reason being that in those of us who spend our lives in the developing world, the fundamentals of the infrastructure are so important to life itself that they do take on a different effect. Infrastructure is more important than anything else, but it's good governance, health, education as one of the four elements that are absolutely fundamental to society function. Now, you could argue that the same for the things that fly in this country, but that's a conversation. But I just want to start to pick up on what I thought was really what Hubert said as mentioned, that the Constitution, he was talking about the United States. Now, I happen to be able to live through that process in South Africa, where, on the one hand, the Constitution, if you like, the system of government, totally determines the infrastructure that you see. If you go up in a helicopter over South African city, you see the footprint of a bus. And even 15 years later, not much has been able to change about that. So government absolutely determines that. And then you see, after that, the process in which the professions, all of us, and business law were able to participate with the system to develop a constitution that arguably is not manifested. Is another example of public-private involvement in your element of what you call infrastructure. So I thought it was worth mentioning. There is, especially in the developing world, and underdeveloped world, there is a very close relationship between the constitution and the system of government and infrastructure.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think those comments are absolutely right on target. And one of the reasons I have been trying to focus the discussion on developed countries, just because I think once you get into the developing world, it's the same stuff, as you said, and it's a totally different set of problems. And I think that I spent a lot of time thinking about what these people have done and thought usefully where we can move forward. And then picking up on the Constitution, which I think Hubert was exactly right to bring to the forefront. I think I'm not interested in American bashing and like Americans are bad people and selfish. I don't think that they are, and I think that's wrong. What I'm trying to get at and figure out, and I think we're getting somewhere, is what are the structural issues that make it so difficult for long-term visions about civic good and to be implemented through infrastructural initiatives in the United States and to some extent in Western Europe, although less so, I think, in Western Europe. Because I don't think it's necessarily a lack of will on an individual basis, but there's something there, whether it's a political structure, whether it's a training of architects or something that I think needs to, or all of these things, that somehow needs to be addressed and reconceptualized in useful ways.
Well, just to sort of answer that, and first of all, I'd like to, and the South African example is really excellent, and to give Northeastern a bit of a plug, I think the two lawyers who actually helped orchestrate the framing of the Constitution were from Northeastern law school.
Should we applaud?
Well, just as FDR, generated an imagined community of this country, and to sort of how he did it was not only politically, but he did it, through the WPA with photographers and artists and writers, so that the entire country felt that they were engaged in the rebuilding of an infrastructure through the TVA and other things. It was, a lesson to learn about this, the interdisciplinary collective effort that is required for infrastructure. The counterexample is Ronald Reagan, whose famous phrase, the 10 worst words you're ever likely to hear in your lifetime, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, actually signaled the beginning of the decline of this common vision for us. And that's what we have to sort of, we've got to sort of build up out of the rubble of Reaganism. And I think a further discussion about public-private partnerships, in my view, should be attractive to the American mind. And it's surprising to me to hear Byron talking about, and Marcel talking about how it's more successful in Europe than it is here. I mean, why aren't we doing it?
Why aren't we doing it?
Why aren't we
I think
engaging
it's a critical question.
private investment in a public purpose?
Now,
I have one theory, it's not a whole theory,
Okay.
but I think it's a pivotal one. Having watched in Europe, where there is the European Union Investment Bank, having watched in China, where there is the government, having watched in Singapore, where there is a government that is so wise about its investments and its structure of the related development entities that are also in the network of control. I think it's a fundamental problem in the United States that there is no regenerative funding, public funding, that's aimed at competitive economic advantage.
okay,
With
explain that.
citizen carrots to say, Portugal, you want to join the EU, here's what you need to do. We'll loan you the money, you'll pay it back, and it will be available to Poland when the time comes. China doesn't have this problem. They just conjure up, 3,000 kilometers or 11,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. We're struggling to get 10 billion out the door to build, another 1,000, maybe 2,000 kilometers of what isn't really even high-speed rail. The Highway Trust Fund did that. The problem is that you see in the Highway Trust Fund what happens to us as a country, which is we allow something to become so rigidified, it only serves its own purpose and doesn't get regenerated to a new one. So the trick for us, I think, is to figure out where that regenerative idea is. You can't call it an infrastructure bank right now, because everybody hates banks. So we have to find a way that there is not surface transportation being reauthorized every 6 years, getting itself calling more victims who Reagan ideas every single time it gets reauthorized, or now, when for the first time in a long time we're actually engaging in the debate of isn't the surface transportation bill not to measure miles of highway built, but rather to measure how we contribute to the competitive economic advantage of cities and regions.
Now, how is that?
We need to get beyond fighting that every 6 years. and understand it's a multi-decade assault, and that changes the way we think about
So you
public
think it's a
events.
funding issue? It's a
No, I
issue
just
of-
said I was proposing one part.
Right, no, I
to be more
understand.
tangible.
But I think that's really smart, and I think it's also, let's just focus on that for a minute, because that's something that can be sold public-private, as a public-private collaboration pretty well. But the question is, who's going to pick food and sell it? I mean, Felix Royton is trying to do this with this National Infrastructure Trust thing, which I don't think is going anywhere, but it's a start.
Well, I think part of the answer, I'd love to hear Marcel's answer to this, but part of the answer is that the money comes to the European Union, but then Portugal can decide whether they are going to have an RFP, whether a private company is going to build, operate, and maintain. It doesn't come with so many rules that
Right.
it isn't a site-specific. And I think that's part of it, and that's why I think reorienting our thinking to mayors who are true leaders who actually can collaborate with the other elected leaders in the region is where we have to go if we want to make this work.
I think it's
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, you said, what's the obstacle that's standing in our way? And I think the interesting thing is that there's a political obstacle, and there's a physical obstacle. It's kind of twofold. So one side of it is that politically, if you can become a hero with a statement like, the worst thing you could hear is, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." Well, you're not going to build common infrastructure on the back of that kind of political sentiment. But the interesting thing is that the physical space also reinforces that, because the question is, what is our kind of collective commitment to the space we share? And I think if you think to the examples that you were talking about how Boston was developed in the kind of historical past, that there was a kind of physical commitment to that space that was shared. And a lot of what was kind of good in that development, even though it was driven by kind of strong private interests, was those private interests recognized that fundamentally shared space.
Let me just break into one second. I think Marilyn is right, that the commitment now is going to come from mayors who have sort of a long-term interest in pushing the development of their particular cities and their feeder region. Go ahead.
It's a good idea, but mayors don't have to want it. Yeah. I mean, it's a great idea. Let's be clear, it's really strong.
Well, I think the start is just establishing, so sort of what's the architect's role in this and what can you do? I think Millennium Park was brought up, and I think it's an interesting and problematic example in terms of how it was done. But the interesting thing is that it has actually created a space in Chicago, which is a city where very little space is shared by the city as a whole. Millennium Park actually has created a space that everyone can kind of recognize as being a shared space. Now, I think that's something that is sort of a rediscovery in Chicago. And I think if you think about the public-private partnerships and maybe why they work in Europe and maybe are more challenging here, is I think that wouldn't be a new discovery in a European city. And so in that public-private partnership, the public has a much stronger hand, and I think therefore can get the public-private partnership to work for the private, but also for the kind of fundamental common good as well. And I think if it's being driven by the private sector, and you've got the mayor who has to kind of follow along because he doesn't have any money, then the private partnership is unbalanced on the other side.
Well, one thing you did have in Chicago is a mayor with a strong vision, and so the public part was in place.
The public own perception of what is civic is very different in this country than it is in other countries. Like, for example, in Chicago, I think, in my correct me if I'm wrong, And the cultural perception of public and civic space in this country is that it is, because it originated as a kind of a form-based measure, but it was to help the kind of sectors of communities that didn't have their own facilities to get by in the world. And so that polarization is a class discussion, and it's a discussion about the city, why the suburbs emerged in the 60s and 70s as the space of the elite, and the city sort of dipped in the 70s and 80s because public was dirty, it was unsafe, it was poor, it was all the things that people disliked about the city, was part of the public life. So I think that it's a cultural sphere as much as a political one.
I think that it does pick up on your point, and Marilyn's point about the new HUD secretary, oh no, your point actually, about the new HUD secretary changing the terms of housing, not as accommodation of last resort, but actually as, you know, a sort of positive outcome. And I think that could, you know, something that has to be made out into the world of discussion.
I do think that's an issue of education, and it's an issue of leadership. I mean, now this is an example I actually don't even know that much about, but I was in Phoenix about a month ago, and they have this new light rail system. You know, one of these unbelievably flat and sprawling southwestern cities, and an incredibly impressive light rail system. Now, someone decided what neighborhood that was going to stop in and what neighborhood it wasn't going to stop in. And from what I understand, it was the governor who just, no, it was the mayor of the city, I think, who just pushed it through. Leadership at a political level and leadership among the stewards of the built environment, all of us, can change that culture, I think, very quickly. Just as there was a very quick shift from the ethos that we've been talking about in the New Deal in the 30s and 40s to the ethos of the 60s and 70s, where everybody said we're not going to do anything enough. But it's a lot of work. Yeah.
One comment on the park issue, the reason I make a comment about the park issue is that when Chicago came to Boston, they were discussing things involved in Greenway. Now, your issue of politics and fairness is a huge issue around the park in Chicago, because they can't even get pocket funds from their year mayor in the other less wealthy areas. And many would say it's just an ego thing for the mayor, when it's really an open space for the people. In the old days, development always had an element to it, a driving element to it, which was about filthy roofing. From the days of the railroad going forward, the reason you had development and the reason you had people kind of doing neat things architecturally, their egos were involved with it, and they were going to make money. The Back Bay, to follow up on the other side of my table, money was going to be made. The private sector was behind this because they were going to build the houses, build the houses, and they were going to make a lot of money. And they were floating bonds over in Europe. Europe has always made their money off of interest in the United States. And that's been the case for roads, TVA, everything. Now, we have a built infrastructure. And the private sector doesn't see where they're going to make money. The Chicago thing, the road thing is better, and we're not going to sell it. It's just not going to happen. And so as a result, it falls almost entirely on the shoulders of the public. To the mayors, to people who have no money, and no idea how they're going to make money on these things going forward. So infrastructure from an economic perspective is no longer seen on Wall Street as it was seen up to basically the 60s. That's what was going on in the 10s.
I'm not sure you're right, because I was...
In fact, I'd love to be wrong.
Yeah, I'd love you to be wrong.
I would love to be proven wrong.
I'm trying to be an optimist here. I was talking to a friend of mine in business who is with the World Economic Forum, and they're doing all these studies on, because he said there are all these super big businessmen who are creating investment funds for infrastructure, but they can't make it work. So they want to invest. They're there. But there's, well, you're right, 20%, it may be that they just want to make too much money in too short a time. Yeah. Okay, we're going to have to close up in a minute, but go ahead, yes. Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a lack of national priority for spending infrastructure that goes to that point. So for instance, when the mayor from any city like Boston or Chicago approaches the federal government to fix their public transportation system, which definitely has economic benefit to the transit developments that occur within it, to the neighborhoods that are affected by it, to the way people just move around productively in the city. They have to argue that that project is more important than building a 100-mile highway which costs the same amount of money in Montana, something like that. And at the level of the Senate, where everyone has equally has two votes,
Right.
it's pretty difficult to argue that. And so I think that in terms of national priority, we're not clear on what's important. There's no real strategy yet. And I saw that you have a mega region.
Right, that was one of the,
Exactly right there. That is is trying to be a prioritization.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
But right now we don't have it. It's wonder, like that, I think the North American, that 100-mile highway in Montana is as civic right now as a public transportation system that would help lots and lots of people.
Right.
I just wonder kind of like things like that.
Yeah, I think there has to be a clear vision and set of agendas at a national level that's propagated, and that's, I think they're trying, but I'm not sure they've gotten there yet. Marcel?
Well, it's difficult for me to say anything about the U.S., and I want to avoid that, making that phrase. That is not what I came to do. But I think the problem is easy and difficult at the same time. Let me try to address a few things. About the businessmen that are ready to jump in. Of course, they need 20%.
Right.
Okay. So, I mean, if you change your taxation system, you don't need the 20%. It's very simple, you know? I mean, let's see, that's the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't speak about it, but that's the beginning of
Right.
public possibility,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's having means available. Okay. The other point, of course, is that it's probably a longer and a more difficult process than just pinpointing on a few things, on one thing. You have been talking, or we have been talking about the change in what architects have been doing. We have formed our architects in the last decennia in order to become a member of the STAR system,
Yeah.
as you call it.
Correct.
And not to become civic
Correct.
civic people, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Their benefit was, and that's not only the architects, it's the whole institution about all the architectural magazines,
Mm-hmm.
and all the criticisms, and so what, except for the New Republic. But I mean,
Yeah,
you understand
you're
what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
And so we are forming our youngsters with an ambition, which is not the ambition of becoming the civic leaders or inventors of new systems of tomorrow.
I do think it's beginning to change.
Absolutely.
But that has been the case for the last 20 years, and it's an enormous problem.
So I am absolutely agreeing and hearing what is happening here and in other schools and universities that I know it's changing.
Yeah.
It's absolutely an important element, and it will only be rewarding in some time.
Now?
The other point, if I may just add, is going back to the local basis, the mayors. In my job for the government, what I have really been pushing is the way that public commissions are being given. No public commission in our country is given now without a competition. Competition between 5 architects. And the people that decide is not architectural jurors. They are there to guarantee that the quality is there. But those who decide are really the politicians, are the people that will have to realize and implement.
Right.
And the fact that they are opposed with 5 potential solutions makes them think about what is possible. The fact that architects are in competition with other architects makes them think about what are their value systems and what they want to do. And the fact that these mayors they are the only power structure today which is not sectorial. The mayor, or let's say the local basis, has to think in an integrative way, because they are immediately confronted with the result of what they're doing spatially. So I think we have to be more hopeful in a way. You know, it's a fantastic goal that is really coming along, but it will not be only for tomorrow.
One of my goals has been to identify what the problems are, and so that we can be more hopeful and say, okay, but until you understand what the structural inhibitors are to move forward to create a vision, we're not going to, we can keep saying we want denser cities and high-speed rail is a good thing, but we're not going to get there. I'm going to let Marilyn have the last word, and then we have to close up.
I don't know if I'm going to the last word, but I was thinking of an example as you were talking about Phoenix, and we were talking about Chicago, which, by the way, I think philanthropy is different than investment. We have to remember that. Millennium is philanthropy. And that is very American, very rich, very wonderful, and not very scalable, because even the melons don't have money. The point I wanted to say is this. We've been privileged to have a very small part in a wonderful example of public will, and that is the Denver light rail system.
Yeah.
Most of us are familiar with it. Let me just sum up its essential qualities. There was no new start federal money available. It was the middle of reauthorization of surface transportation ever and ever. The mayors of Denver and the 22 other municipalities led a campaign which was taken up by the business community and by civic leaders to get positive votes from 23, I guess, altogether municipalities of an additional 1% sales tax.
That's great.
To build light rail. So that shows you that the will is possible when the objective is clear. And when it's that kind of vote, yes, the RTD and the city and the COG, and they're all squabbling about who's in charge of the project and so forth, but that's noise compared to the extraordinary advent of the public will that really has now, because it's been several years in the making, people are living in transit-oriented developments so they can save their car for going skiing and promote well-being and all those other kind of wonderful things. So it's a great example that we can afford to trumpet a little bit more. I did want to say one sort of ending thing. And when you were talking about the star system, it made me want to say this, so forgive me, I don't mean this to sound crotchety, but it's not objective, I guess, in this practice. Infrastructure is not the next fashion. It should not be something that architects or designers flock to because it's a good place to hide and go to work in the next 3 to 5 years. Infrastructure is a commitment to seriously hard work, which is rewarded by a very long wait for what you hope will be extraordinarily high aspiration. So it is for the serious of heart. Extraordinary, but just to be sure, it is not for everybody. Don't do it because it sounds intriguing. Do it because you fundamentally believe it.
And it demands civic engagement. It demands civic and public engagement all the time, over and over and over again. Now, I'm going to open it up to the audience. I see you, you in the back, both one on the right first, or my right.
We are fortunate to have among our ministers representatives of central transportation planning.
Wonderful.
Right.
Welcome.
I'd like to make an observation.
Okay.
You raise your hand to refer to me. You set this for
I do. Go ahead.
Yes.
Since I'm the czar.
So we heard 2 words. Warren Buffett. Okay, there is money still to be made in infrastructure. And I want to, we talk about money, and then you have sort of like closed systems, sort of systems with their own sort of internal revenue stream, of which the railroad, the freight railroads are one, and the Mass Water Resources Authority are sort of another. And these systems, they develop their own revenue when they spend it. And they may not be, but they're improving. I'll give you an example. Like that Mass Water Resources Authority, somebody set some rule, tighten some rule on water quality. Happens all the time. They can go purchase a filtration orchestrated system, whatever it takes, and they just send us a bill, and we pay. So we have this internal revenue system. Same in the railroad. The railroads aren't expanding, but they're improving. Somebody says a rule that your vehicles are just duty, you got X number of years. Fine, you have a revenue stream, they scrap the old vehicles, they get new vehicles, they improve the system from the internal revenue stream. And these are very, very important infrastructure systems. The crisis in infrastructure is, they have challenges, but the crisis is not in the system which has sort of this internal revenue stream. The crisis is from like the other systems, like roads. You build a highway from a revenue stream, but the revenue stream, gas tax, the revenue stream does not support the rebuilding of the highway. It goes down right on it. You have a system whose internal revenue stream is inadequate. That's why we have conferences like this. What do we do about infrastructure?
Right.
The ones with the internal revenue stream to take care of themselves actually doing a very, very good job.
Good, thank you. Yes.
One of the things that I know we talk a lot about large-scale problems that are political, social, quite daunting to take on. But I think as far as what architects today can do, and picking up on about the formation of architects, I think it's a curious phenomenon that happens. You start in school where you have a beginning of a specialization between your architect and your landscape architect and the urban planner and your engineer. And this sort of decision, in practice, kind of turns into something like, well, I don't know anything about that, so someone else is problem. So I'm not going to design the open space because the landscape architect is going to come along and do it. So I think that there has to be some sort of way of fitting together and or forming a way of beginning to make sure that we're raising all the issues and discussing all the not leaving anything out because it's somebody else going to come along and fix it. We have to, talking about it in school, talking about that in practice, finding a way of not saying, well, it's not a consultant, so.
No, I think one of my goals in this panel was to get across that I think the role of the if we have created a star system, I think we have to reconceptualize what the role of the architect is, or what an architect is and does, in order to effectively begin to address these problems.
Well, we don't know anything about that because we're not, another designer of the plan, so I think it's just those ways.
Yeah.
Make sure that we're actually,
Enough.
we're
Yeah.
recognized that.
Okay, we've already gone over. We have to stop. Thank you. This was wonderful. All our panelists have made wonderful contributions, and thank you to the audience too.